Welcome to the Religion and Politics section late in the day here on Sunday. I'm glad you're here. Our theme for this session is Retooling the Climate Change Debate, New Social, Theological, and Philosophical Perspectives. I'm Robbie Jones. I'm the co-chair of the Religion and Politics section here at the AAR. Pleased to welcome everybody here today. So I see people coming in the back. If you'll come on down front, that will help us all out here. And we're going to go roughly in the order that the papers are scheduled here as you see them. First, I will introduce our panelists, our presenters for today. To my right is Robin Veldman. She's an assistant professor of religious studies at Iowa State University and co-editor along with sociologist Andrew Saz and Randolph Haluza DiLeo of the volume How the World's Religions Are Responding to Climate Change, Social Scientific Investigations, released in 2014. She studies how religious beliefs shape environmental attitudes and behavior. Next, we have Jeff Morgan, a doctoral candidate at the University of Notre Dame. He's currently writing a dissertation on conscience and the thought of Kant, Kierkegaard, and Barth, and teaching a course on environmental ethics. And last, on the right, we have Daniel DiLeo, is a Flatley Fellow and PhD student in theological ethics at Boston College. He's also the project manager of the Catholic Climate Covenant and writes for both Millennial Journal and Political Theology Today. So our papers today will take up the topics, really kind of looking at the debates over climate change and how they've evolved well beyond the environmentalist framework of the last generation that has become increasingly fragmented. And I'm excited about these papers because they break some new conceptual ground by analyzing social factors influencing attitudes on climate change, exploring some new philosophical categories that can help us think through moral reasoning in this area, and developing some new insights for Catholic policy priorities and evaluating, indeed, some existing Catholic policy priorities from the perspective of Thomistic virtue ethics. So let me turn it over first to Daniel DiLeo.
Well, thank you all for being here. I'm excited, and hopefully this will contribute to the conversation. Yep, there we go. All right, perfect. So on July 30th, 2014, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops sent a letter to the administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency offering support for a national carbon pollution standard in response to climate change. In the letter, the bishops also outlined 6 ethical criteria they feel should guide national rules for carbon pollution. These criteria are essentially rooted in Catholic social teaching and include respect for human life and dignity. The regulations and all efforts to reduce the impact of climate change should respect human life and dignity, especially that of the poorest and most vulnerable, from children in the womb to the elderly. In particular, these measures must protect poor and vulnerable communities and persons from the health impacts of climate change, including exposure to climate-sensitive diseases, heat waves, and diminished air quality. Prudence on behalf of the common good. We believe that wise action to address climate change is required now to protect the common good for present and future generations. Priority for the poor and vulnerable. The consequences of climate change will be borne by the world's most vulnerable people. Inaction will worsen their suffering. Social and economic justice. Workers should be protected from the negative effects on the workforce resulting from the new standards, and should receive assistance to mitigate impacts on their livelihoods and families. Any additional costs that such standards may generate must be distributed fairly without undue burden on the poor. Care for creation. We are called to be responsible stewards of the earth and to use the gifts we have been given to protect human life and dignity now and in the future. And finally, participation. Local communities should have a voice in shaping these standards based on their local impact, especially low-income communities whose voice is often not heard. It is in accord with their dignity that they participate in this process. On one hand, the bishop's ethical criteria for carbon pollution rules has provided a solid foundation upon which Catholics have subsequently analyzed and advocated around the EPA's proposed Clean Power Plan. On the other hand, however, it seems that the bishop's framework could be further strengthened if Catholic social teaching was better integrated into Aquinas' comprehensive, virtue-based model of theological ethics. Guided by this belief, I will seek to do three things in this paper. First, I will make the case that the tenets of Catholic social teaching can and should be understood as Thomistic secondary moral precepts. In addition, I will use the synthetic framework of what might be called Thomistic Catholic social teaching to critique the USCCB's ethical criteria for a national carbon pollution standard. Finally, I will offer recommendations for how the bishop's criteria might be improved in light of Thomistic Catholic social teaching. In sum, I will attempt to analyze and enhance the USCCB's ethical criteria for a national carbon pollution standard by developing and systematizing the relationship between Thomistic virtue ethics and Catholic social teaching. In order to integrate Aquinas' ethical theory in Catholic social teaching, it's important to first outline both traditions. As is well known, Aquinas' ethical system is teleological, and in part seeks to foster temporal, imperfect happiness through the acquired and interrelated virtues of prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. Towards this end, Aquinas recognizes the speculative and practical intellect and names synderesis as the habit by which the speculative intellect intuitively knows the first general precepts of the natural law. In addition, Aquinas also identifies secondary moral precepts that are prudentially discerned from the first precepts of the natural law through the practical reason for the purpose of cultivating virtue. Finally, Aquinas observes that secondary moral precepts can be prudentially applied to particular situations in order to generate, for the sake of virtue, laws valid in most but not all cases. James T. Bretsky calls these laws concrete material norms, and given this term, Aquinas' ethical theory can generally be outlined as follows. General precepts lead to secondary moral precepts, lead to concrete material norms. In light of what's been said so far, it's worth highlighting briefly Aquinas' terminological distinction between principles and precepts. In his article, the Relationship of Virtues and Norms in the Summa Theologiae, Daniel Daly reflects on question 94, Article 2 of the Prima Secundae to clarify the distinction. Based on his reading, Daly concludes that for Aquinas, a principle is a source or origin of something else, while a precept is a prescriptive statement that follows from a principle. In particular, he observes that the first principle of practical reason is that all things seek the good, while the first precept of practical reason is the natural law claim that good is to be done and pursued and evil is to be avoided. Although this distinction between principles and precepts may seem trivial, it will be important later when we attempt to integrate Aquinas' ethics and Catholic social teaching. Now that the framework of Aquinas' virtue-based ethics has been presented, we can turn to and similarly outline the tradition known as Catholic social teaching. In general, the Vatican describes Catholic social teaching as a body of key magisterial documents that propose principles for reflection, provide criteria for judgment, and give guidelines for action. In particular, Catholic social teaching has come to be defined by the commitment to a list of key concepts that are repeated throughout these documents. According to William J. Byron's comprehensive list, there are 10 such pillars: human dignity, respect for human life, association, participation, preferential protection for the poor and vulnerable, solidarity, stewardship, subsidiarity, human equality, and the common good. In outlining this tradition, it's important to emphasize two things. First, Catholic social teaching has developed. Its tenets are not atemporal, but have been prudentially discerned and refined over a long period of inductive moral reasoning. In addition, it's also important to recognize that the Church calls people of faith to prudentially apply the pillars of Catholic social teaching to particular situations for the sake of justice. As such, and in sum, Catholic social teaching can be understood as a discerned body of what Kenneth Himes calls ethical coordinates that can help prudentially guide persons and communities towards justice. In light of the assessment of both Aquinas ethics and Catholic social teaching, it might be expected that Catholic ethicists would have worked to integrate the two frameworks. There is much common ground between the two traditions, and their synthesis could both leverage the strengths and make up for the relative deficiencies of each. For example, bringing together Aquinas ethics and Catholic social teaching would enable Thomists to benefit from centuries of discerned wisdom and apply some of the most current ethical insights to pressing social challenges. Similarly, such a fusion would enable those working with Catholic social teaching to coherently utilize all of the cardinal virtues and provide a clear account of how to generate public, concrete, material norms through Thomistic political prudence. Surprisingly and unfortunately, however, Aquinas' virtue ethics and Catholic social teaching generally seem to have moved along what might be termed parallel but intermittently intersecting tracks. Thomistic virtue ethicists do not often reference Catholic social teaching, while those working in Catholic social teaching generally only utilize the Thomistic cardinal virtues of prudence and justice. In light of this lacuna, there seems to be an opportunity and a need to constructively bring together Aquinas ethics and Catholic social teaching. Although there are likely several ways to synthesize these two traditions, one way is to understand the tenets of Catholic social teaching as Thomistic secondary moral precepts. This is due to the fact that, as has been shown, the precepts of Catholic social teaching have been prudentially discerned for the sake of virtue and can be prudentially applied to generate concrete material norms. When Catholic social teaching is thus understood as a set of Thomistic secondary moral precepts, Catholic ethicists gain a distinct moral framework that is uniquely systematic, theologically rigorous, and particularly attuned to the Church's collective moral wisdom. Based on the foregoing discussion, it's now possible to consider how the USCCB's ethical criteria for carbon pollution rules can benefit from Thomistic Catholic social teaching. As described, the USCCB presents in its July 30th letter particular directives generally derived from select Catholic social teaching precepts. Within the context of Thomistic Catholic social teaching, the bishop's criteria can be understood as concrete material norms, presented here in plain text, obtained through the application of political prudence to secondary moral precepts, presented here in bold. Understood as such, there seem to be at least three ways in which the bishop's framework can be subsequently and significantly strengthened. First, and rooted in the virtuous telos of Aquinas ethics, the bishop should explicate that the goal of their framework is to prudentially attain the ends, that is to say, the moral means, appointed by the interrelated cardinal virtues of justice, temperance, and fortitude. Next, the bishop should draw on Aquinas' insight that prudence is perfected through counsel to insist that climate deliberations be guided by ongoing dialogue with the world's foremost climate scientists. Finally, the USCCB should utilize all rather than just some of the precepts of Catholic social teaching. In light of these recommendations, the USCCB should revise its proposed set of secondary moral precepts and concrete material norms to reflect the fullness of Thomistic Catholic social teaching. Although there are many possibilities for how this revision might look, I propose the following iteration of secondary moral precepts and concrete material norms. When applied with political prudence to the carbon policy deliberations, I believe these precepts and norms can foster the justice, temperance, and fortitude necessary to help the U.S. establish an effective national carbon pollution standard. And in this list, the italics are the ones that I've constructed. So the bold is the secondary precept, the plain text is the existing concrete material norm, and the italics is what I've come up with. Human life and dignity. U.S. carbon pollution rules should be prudentially guided by mainstream climate science in order to foster temperate consumption of natural resources and so protect persons from the degrading, unjust, and potentially fatal consequences of climate change. Human equality, solidarity, and the common good. U.S. carbon pollution rules should balance the interests of a few against the common good of present and future generations. This will require, among other things, fortitude in the face of powerful vested interests. Priority for the poor and vulnerable, and this is taken essentially almost verbatim from the social and economic justice that the bishops proposed. Workers should be protected from negative effects on the workforce resulting from the new standards and should receive assistance to mitigate impacts on their livelihoods and families. Any additional costs that such standards may generate must be distributed fairly without undue, unjust burden on the poor. Association and subsidiarity. U.S. carbon pollution rules should be established in light of at least three socio-political realities: the historical failure of domestic climate change mitigation efforts, the need for carbon pollution rules in all sectors of the American economy, and the capacity of domestic U.S. climate change mitigation policy to bolster or undermine international treaty negotiations that the U.S. has a justice-based obligation to support. Care for creation. We are called to be responsible stewards of the earth and to use the gifts we have been given to protect human life and dignity now and in the future. U.S. carbon pollution rules should thus be prudentially guided by mainstream climate science in order to foster temperate consumption of natural resources and avoid the potentially irreversible and runaway adverse ecological consequences of climate change. And finally, participation. Local communities should have a voice in shaping these standards based on their local impact, especially low-income communities whose voice is often unjustly not heard. It is in accordance with their dignity that they participate in the process. In his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict XVI declared that the Church has a responsibility towards creation, and she must assert this responsibility in the public sphere. Guided by this sentiment, this paper has sought to strengthen the USCCB's ethical criteria for a national carbon pollution standard by constructing a framework of Thomistic Catholic social teaching. Although it remains to be seen whether U.S. Catholics at large will follow the bishop's advocacy lead, I hope that my suggestions here can help the USCCB to further inspire and more sharply guide faithful citizenship in the face of climate change. Thank you.
Great.
Okay, so shifting from the world of Catholicism, I'm going to be talking about evangelicalism, which actually we've heard a lot about over the past couple days. So I'm talking about, in particular, some conclusions I've come to about some underlying factors that are encouraging evangelicals to be skeptical about climate change. So actually, much of the research on religious traditions, how religious traditions in the U.S. are responding to climate change, has focused on evangelicals, and that, of course, is because they have significant cultural and political clout and form a significant component of the Republican base. So many observers have suggested that their participation is in the climate movement could be a key factor that shifts, that gives the climate movement the momentum that it needs. So this has attracted a lot of scholarly attention. And there's been a number of indicators, and you may be familiar with this from other talks that you've seen today, or yesterday, indicators that evangelicals were warming. There was the Evangelical Climate Initiative's Climate Change, a Call to Action, the Southern Baptist Declaration on the Environment and Climate Change, and there's been a wealth of scholarship devoted to understanding how evangelicals have started to engage this issue of climate change. So in both scholarly and journalistic accounts published in the in the wake of events like this, evangelicals are depicted as potentially poised to embrace the issue of climate change. However, there's been a new turn in research, especially since 2010, where people have pointed out that there is not only a sort of a climate care movement, but there's also the opposite, this Beisner-led anti-climate movement, climate skeptic movement. So it kind of parallels the secular debate in many ways. You have one side which accepts global warming, that global warming is caused primarily by human activities, and argues that Christians have a responsibility for speaking in favor to stop it, while the other side argues that the science isn't settled and that actually maybe a better way to protect the poor is to pursue economic development and not worry about climate change at this point. So with both sides of these movements kind of battling for the evangelical laity's allegiance, the question becomes whether is some kind of mass movement going to emerge, and if so, which side is it going to fall on? And of course, we have some hints from the research that Robbie presented on Saturday to what the answer to this is. One way we might start to try to answer this question is to determine where the evangelical laity starts. And before yesterday, I could say that we didn't have any studies within the last 2 years. Now we know that they remain very skeptical. So this is not a surprise given there has been no turn towards accepting climate change, so it seems, among the laity. And another study that I haven't heard anybody else talk about found recently that even when you control for political party affiliation, that biblical literalism still comes out as a significant factor predicting climate skepticism. There's various ways to define that, but not believing that climate change is either happening or caused by humans. So we do now have studies finally showing that it goes beyond just politics. Of course, politics plays an important role, but there's also something going on with religion, and that's really what I want to explore today. obviously, you can't ignore politics, and we've talked about how evangelicals in other panels, of course, are exposed to more conservative news sources that tend to present more skeptical stances on climate change, so it's not surprising that they would be persuaded by these opinions a little bit more. There's been a number of theories also advanced in the literature that try to parse out what religious factors might be influencing evangelicals' skepticism. People have pointed to a culture of scientific skepticism that derives from the creation-evolution debate, an individualistic orientation that discourages collective social action, and certain theological beliefs, including dominion beliefs or belief about the end of the world, that might encourage skepticism about climate change. So in my own field research, which I conducted in 2011 and 2012 in Georgia, I was persuaded that some of these factors do play a role, but I also came across a factor that I think is underlying and perhaps a little bit more fundamental that contributes to evangelical climate change skepticism. And actually, I should mention here, by skepticism, I'm grouping, there's different people, different talks have included different beliefs in that category. What I mean is anybody who believes that climate change is either not happening or is mainly due to natural variation. I would categorize all those individuals as skeptics because none of them think anything needs to be done about it. And I think for anybody who's participating in or hopeful about the climate movement, that's the salient distinction. So what I sort of discovered as I was doing my field research in Georgia is that a key factor seems to be the historically rooted hostility toward mainstream secular culture, a so-called culture of embattlement that many evangelicals, in which many evangelicals believe that the secular world is bent on displacing Christianity from American public life. And so to suggest that this culture of embattlement is kind of underlying evangelical climate skepticism is not to deny the influence of a number of the other factors that I just mentioned that scholars have pointed out, but to try to better understand what's at stake for evangelicals in defending and maintaining those certain theological beliefs which seem to prevent accepting climate change. And doing so, I believe, helps explain why evangelicals are disproportionately inclined to view climate change with skepticism and hostility, and why, the answer, I think, is because to do otherwise for them would be to relinquish the interpretive frame that both makes sense of their current experience and sustains their collective identity. So there is something really core about their identity that, not to say that every evangelical would agree with this, but the general pattern, I think, can be explained by looking at the hostility that has pervaded some circles of evangelicalism. So contrary to many who have hoped that if you just kind of get some more scientific education out there and get evangelicals to engage in a little better, perhaps theological reflection, that they may change their minds. From what I'm seeing, I actually think this skepticism is very deeply rooted, and I would suggest that to the extent that this so-called embattled mentality persists within evangelicalism, I would expect anthropogenic climate change to continue to be a very hard sell within those communities. So that's kind of an overview of where I'm going with this argument. I'm going to break it down into a couple of pieces. I'm going to talk a little bit about my methods and how I came up with this argument. Then I'm going to talk about how conservative Christians, some of them view themselves as persecuted and marginalized from mainstream society. Then I turn to discussing how this influences their perception of climate change. And finally, I connect this to Christian Smith's and his colleagues, he's a sociologist of religion, so-called subcultural identity theory, which posits that this embattled mentality is actually pivotal to the evangelical movement's vitality in the modern world. So with that said, let me start off with my very brief description of my method. So this is based on focus group research. I conducted 9 focus groups in theologically conservative Christians in southeastern Georgia, and all of them belong to evangelical denominations. This was a small number, it was a total of 57 interviews. Individuals participated in these groups, which I supplemented with participant observation in Bible studies and interviews with pastors, and I really sought to immerse myself in their world as much as I could as somebody who is not from that world. And so the result is that what I found there in Georgia is certainly not generalizable because it comes out of communities that are embedded in a particular culture in southern Georgia. But I have found that there's a few other empirical studies conducted in other parts of the country, and they have come up with this same narrative, although not connecting it in the same way that I'm seeing the connection. So this suggests to me that it's actually far more broadly applicable, and I'll point out places where where these other studies kind of come to the same conclusion. So much for the methods. Now I'll go on to talk about my informant's sense of being persecuted and marginalized by the secular world. So, of course, there's no one conservative Christian worldview. There are many. Evangelicalism is a varied tradition, and many people have different views within it. But there are certain narrative strands that tend to come up over and over again, and these commonalities, especially that I experienced and others have talked about in the literature, suggest that there is some, at least within some circles of evangelicalism, kind of a core narrative structure that frames how they view the world. So my informants in particular, I asked them what the church contributed to society, and they talked a lot about, hope, love, change, and a lot of positive things that Christianity gives to people. At the same time, however, they felt that the mainstream society sort of callously and self-defeatingly rejected what their faith had to offer. So I heard many references to how Christians were being marginalized, ridiculed, and persecuted. At one focus group I conducted at a Presbyterian church in America, Lee, this is a pseudonym, of course, a general contractor in his 20s, discussed the challenges that Christians faced when interacting with a larger society, stating that, quote, "The Bible talks about how just as Jesus suffered and was spit on and made fun of, it guarantees that you as a Christian will go through the same persecution. I think that's the reality of living in the world, that you're not going to be the most popular group. And this feeling of having to bear scrutiny for one's faith was widespread. To pick out another quote, a pastor from a Southern Baptist church told me that Christians who stand up for what they believe in will always face societal condemnation because, quote, "When you stand up for what you believe, you'll be out of step with the world, which puts an enmity between you and them. Jesus talked about the sword. He said, 'I didn't come to bring peace,' but the sword is not in our hands. It's in the hands of those who don't believe what we believe. Christians can easily become hated because of our adherence to Christ's teachings and who we believe him to be historically." So many of the Christians I talked to adhered to this worldview, believing that they were being pushed out of mainstream society. And this meant that they were alert to any further attacks from the secular world, which they viewed ready to kind of always trying to force them out further. And this is exactly where climate change entered the picture. So this is moving on to the third part, where I'm now going to talk about how this embattled mentality was connected to climate change, to their interpretations of climate change. So one of the most common sentiments I heard in my focus groups, and we can talk about why this differs from what Robbie's polling came up with, but was that to accept anthropogenic climate change was to deny the belief that God is in control. And the argument for them was that if God has sovereignty over the earth, then he surely controls the climate. So to suggest that humans are in fact the one who control the climate through their carbon emissions is to deny God's power and his sovereignty over the earthly realm. So to take one example, when I asked participants in a focus group at an independent fundamental Baptist church how their faith affected their views on climate change, Peter, a man in his 30s who worked at a local pulp mill, said, quote, "When I look at climate change, I have the mindset that God's in control. If he doesn't want it to get hot, it's not going to be. And I know a lot of people think that's a naive attitude, but I think that's where we go back to. If he doesn't want it to happen, it's not going to happen." And so even knowing that others, and referring to the fact that others might find this perspective to be naive, he held firm in his faith. And this becomes meaningful when you think about it in the context of marginalization. So having to cut out some quotes because I always make this talk too long, but another man who attended a Christian church expressed a similar view. He viewed climate change as a pattern of hubris that was endemic to environmental narratives. So he told the group, the focus group I conducted there, that, quote, "At the root of environmentalism is the belief that man is in control of this world. For instance, the experts will debate with global warming, will the climate get so hot that we'd melt the glacier ice caps, yet nowhere in the discussion is the possibility that God might be able to maintain a consistent temperature. I think at the core of it is the denial that God is in control and that the earth's destiny is within the hand of man rather than God." So for him, again, there was a major conflict between environmental narratives and his own way of looking at the world. And environmentalists were, in fact, kind of on the attack, ready to push out anyone who would believe that this core tenet of his faith, that God is in control. And then I also heard people say that claims that anthropogenic climate change could destroy the earth were intended to deny biblical teachings about the end times. And this, I think, is another iteration of that same argument, that anybody who talks about climate change is only doing so because of this ulterior motive that they have to try to like persecute and push, sort of attack the Christian worldview. So this is how, in short, I see the embattled mentality connecting to how the people that I talk to interpreted climate change. And the two studies that I would mention, there's one by Catherine Wilkinson, another one by Wiley Carr and his colleagues, who both ran into the same emphasis on God is in control. This was in, one of them was in Texas and the other one was in South Carolina. So suggesting at least within southern states, there's potentially a similar discourse that ways in which evangelicals are connecting the God is in control narrative and using it to sort of underpin their skepticism. And I'm cutting out a lot because, of course, they don't just talk about religious beliefs in defining why they're skeptical. But I think this is one of the key reasons that they are. So now, having talked about this embattled mentality, how it affects their views on climate change, I want to talk really quickly about relying on Christian Smith's subcultural identity theory to argue that this, unfortunately, seems to be a very deeply rooted perspective. So Christian Smith and his colleagues argue in their book, American Evangelicalism, Embattled and Thriving, that this is a quote, American evangelicalism is strong not because it is shielded against, but because it is, or at least perceives itself to be, embattled with forces that seem to oppose or threaten it. Indeed, evangelicalism, we suggest, thrives on distinction, engagement, tension, conflict, and threat. Without these, evangelicalism would lose its identity and purpose and grow languid and aimless. Thus, the movement's vitality is not a product of its protected isolation from, but its vigorous engagement with pluralistic modernity. So in his research, which is sort of broadly looking at, was a more generalized sample, found the same narrative, which is another reason I feel confident in saying that it's not just something I found in Georgia. According to this subcultural identity theory, evangelicalism thrives in modernity because it cultivates a sense of distinction from and tension with out-groups, and this includes mainstream society or the world. And this tension has helped the tradition persist and thrive because it has enhanced solidarity and collective identity within the group and also galvanized the group against its enemies. So if you put his work together with mine, it seems to suggest that the conflict-infused worldview that my informants drew on when framing climate change as an assault on their faith may at the same time contribute to evangelicalism's vitality. And if that is the case, then you can't really, it's hard to dismiss it lightly. You can't say, let's just get rid of one piece. So to put it a little bit crudely, for those lay evangelicals who subscribe to this worldview to accept anthropogenic climate change, this embattled mentality to accept anthropogenic climate change, they would need to abandon their fight against the world. Yet it is this fight that gives them a sense of both purpose and identity. So this is the reason for my conclusion that you can't address climate skepticism within the evangelical community just through scientific education and asking them to think a little more deeply about some theological propositions that they hold. It's deeply rooted in their identity. So this is a very abbreviated version of my argument, and of course it would need more elaboration. I appreciate your patience with this condensed version. I feel that it's actually somewhat urgent to get it out there and see what other researchers have to say about it, because if it's correct, then there's some implications to that. And I want to talk about what I think they are really briefly. So the first is that if the emphasis on the embattled mentality within evangelicalism declines, this could and should, if my argument is correct, enhance prospects for collaboration between environmentalists and evangelicals, or between climate activists and evangelicals. Whether this is occurring is a matter of debate at this moment. There's a lot of sort of back and forth. People are trying to decide which way it's going, and we don't really know the answer to that question right now. There was a recent study that came out in 2014 that found that 50% of Christians perceive themselves to be the victims of significant discrimination. So I take that to mean that there are a number of Christians who do still subscribe to this embattled mentality. So the implication of this, I think, is that if this embattled mentality does persist, then climate activists should really be looking elsewhere for allies. And time is of the essence, so I would suggest, and I was thinking of this before Robbie's study, but it confirmed it so nicely that they should really be looking in minority communities that actually have an interest in addressing climate change because they're experiencing and expected to experience the impacts disproportionately. So I think it makes more sense to try to work with those groups rather than to convince a tradition that has this deeply rooted skepticism. There's also the possibility, I think there are ways to frame the issue of climate change so that evangelicals will not perceive it as threatening to your identity, to faith and identity. And Dan Kahan, whose name has been thrown around a lot in some of these talks, has some really good research that shows how, or starts to talk about how you can frame the question in different ways. So it's not whether, are you that dumb person who denies climate change, or, do you accept the truth, but how do he has a case study in Florida where he talks about, a community that is polarized about climate change, and yet they were able to get everybody on board to deal with some of the sea level rise problems that they're having. So you shift the conversation so that it doesn't really directly attack identity. And this brings me to my one and only slide, which is that if climate activists are going to be trying to work with evangelicals, I think they need to get a lot better at understanding where evangelicals are coming from and better at framing their messages in ways that are not going to upset evangelicals and turn them off. And hopefully, yes. This is, there was a poster contest for the People's Climate March, which was a wonderful event. My only complaint was one of the winning posters they picked was this, which I think is probably the worst message you could ever send if you want anybody who adheres to a biblical tradition, or especially evangelicalism, to try to get on board with this message, because it's basically saying, get out of here, we don't want you. Essentially. So I think that, finally, climate activists need to think about their messaging a little bit if they are going to try to work with evangelicals. So that's it. Thank you.
I don't have any slides, so you can just look at me up there the whole time. So in this paper, through an engagement with Willis Jenkins' recent work, I want to consider the place of conscience as moral self-awareness in an ethics of climate change. Conscience as moral self-awareness is not something Jenkins gives any significant direct attention to in his recent work, but I think it's a theme relevant to his work, especially his argument that climate change is a problem that renders us as moral agents morally incompetent. Fundamental to his idea that we are incompetent moral agents is that we are now incoherent moral agents. We are now unable to answer questions such as, where am I? What is going on? What is my role? And consequently, what should I do? Our moral agency, in light of the problem of climate change and Jenkins' diagnosis, actually reminds me a bit of my first semester of doctoral coursework. It was not atypical after any given class session for me to turn to a friend and ask, what just happened? And like many of first-year doctoral students, I then found myself asking, what am I doing here? Do I belong? Is this really the place for me? Who am I? I was nonplussed, and so are we now, according to Jenkins, before this overwhelming and unprecedented problem. Jenkins' conception of our moral incompetence, I think, is nicely complemented by H. Richard Niebuhr's theory of conscience. Niebuhr's theory of conscience, in other words, helpfully extends and illuminates how it is that our very sense of ourselves as moral agents, according to Jenkins, is threatened by the problem of climate change. So this is Niebuhr's theory of conscience. Niebuhr's theory of conscience begins with the idea of an internalized other. He explains that to have a conscience is to have the experience of being judged by another person, though the other is not immediately or symbolically and physically present to the sense-experiencing person. Conscience, he writes, is a function of my existence as a social being, always aware of the approvals or disapprovals of my actions by my fellow men. We can be confident in this claim about conscience, Niebuhr explains, because we see much more clearly now than ever before the social character of all human life. To be a self in the presence of other selves, he writes, is not a derivative experience but primordial. Niebuhr is claiming that a person not only rightly knows herself in her relation to other selves, but also that her moral agency, as he puts it, exists in that relation. The self, as that which can be an object to itself, is, he says, essentially a social structure. It arises in social experiences. So how does conscience enter into this picture? Niebuhr explains that conscience is most basically the experience of finding, as he calls it, an altar in the ego. It is the experience of transcending ourselves by becoming an object to ourselves, and so in the conscience we see ourselves as an other because we see ourselves through the eyes of another that we have internalized. We come to selfhood as we internalize the general ethos of a group. We acquire a kind of composite photo of the group, which then in turn becomes a kind of filter or lens through which we see ourselves. Niebuhr offers the qualification that because we live in many communities, we internalize more than one societal ethos, and because we don't interact with groups but with individuals within groups, we meet in the ego-alter dialectic, he says, something general in the particular. What Niebuhr means is that within a particular culture, a person has relationships that exhibit constancies, and these constancies are intelligible only within their particular systems or cultures of interaction. The alter in my ego may be my brother, for example, but my brother as his way of being represents or discloses to me something particular about my family's culture. To say then that we meet in conscience something general in the particular is to say, as Niebuhr explains, that the conscience represents not so much my awareness of the approvals or disapprovals of others, as of other individuals, as the ethos of my society. It represents its mode of interpersonal interactions. What this means is that an individual rightly knows herself only as she knows herself in a context of continuous interactions over a long period of time. It is as though our actions are contributions to an ongoing conversation, and we can only act well as we come to know the role given to us to play in this conversation. And we can only come to know and understand the role as we listen to the alters we find in our ego, as they hold us accountable to the mores of the conversation in which we participate with them. A person lives in many societies and has a plurality of these ego-alter dialectics. And in this plurality, there will be tensions and even conflicts. The individual must therefore find what Niebuhr calls the ultimate community of interaction, and correlatively, the most fundamental ego-alter dialectic, a kind of uber conscience. This ultimate community and fundamental ego-alter dialectic give the individual the most comprehensive interpretive purchase on her agency in the broadest context of her life. So, say a young person from a Southern Tea Party family graduates college and goes to work for AmeriCorps. He likely begins to feel after a little while a tension within himself between these two cultures, AmeriCorps and the Tea Party, as they become internalized and come to him in particular ways in his conscience, or perhaps we should say his consciences. Both ostensibly represent some ideal about how to be loyal to the cause of America, but they do so in ways that for the most part, or perhaps in every part, clash. If his agency as a loyal American is to be coherent and meaningful, then he must discern which of these two communities, which of these two ego-alter dialectics he is going to prioritize. This, at least, is how Niebuhr depicts the tension in the conscience, or between consciences. This tension prompts the need to find a resolution between internalized claims of accountability. Without finding this resolution, a person cannot act as a responsible self, and so moral agency will be incoherent. As a religious ethicist, Niebuhr's assumption here is that God comes to us in and through our relations with these others. And so when the individual discerns her most fundamental ego-alter dialectic, when she discerns the internalized social ethos that is most determinative of her moral self-awareness, she is making a claim that it is here, in and through her life with this group, that she finds the source of her absolute dependence. It is here in this community that she finds her relation to God most deeply conditioned, and so it is in relation to this ultimate community of interaction, this most fundamental ego-alter dialectic, that she knows herself most clearly, and according to which she also discerns the right order of all the other ego-alter dialectics she finds within herself. It is this most fundamental ego-alter dialectic that she cannot deny without also denying herself as a responsible self, as a coherent moral agent. It is this prospect of the dissolution or denial of agency that especially resonates with Jenkins' account of moral incompetence. Jenkins explains that the problem of climate change has put at risk the future of agency for religious communities. He depicts a moral community and agents within that community faced with a tension that calls into question the most fundamental source of their moral agency. If the individual Christian and the Christian community, for example, are unable to conceive of what it means to think of oneself and to act as a Christian during a time of climate change, then the fate of Christian ethics, of Christian moral agency, and of Christianity as a meaningful way of life are at risk. By diagnosing incompetence, Jenkins writes, an ethicist calls into question the future of agency within a tradition, and so summons members of that tradition to generate some possibility of acting well within the new relations of an unprecedented problem. So, we might say, on the one hand, that the Christian conscience, in Niebuhr's terms, is a moral self-awareness before the internalization of particular individuals who represent something general about a Christian community's life. On the other hand, in Jenkins' terms, we might say that this Christian conscience is now out of its depth and on the brink of dissolution. So what can one informed by such a conscience do? Where lie the possibilities of rescuing one's very agency from incoherence and incompetence? At this point, conceptually, Jenkins' language shifts, so that it is no longer moral agency simply considered that is overwhelmed. It is not even so much Christian moral agency simply considered that is overwhelmed by climate change. It is North Atlantic and perhaps especially North American moral agency, Christian moral agency included, that is overwhelmed and therefore at risk. Jenkins considers an indigenous climate justice project that, he says, interprets its own claims and actions as resistance to ecologically mediated genocide. He concludes, even if politically unsuccessful in changing climate policy, their tactics resist genocide by sustaining the capability of their cultural repertories to name it. They remain morally competent, so long as they have in their repertory some practice through which to reliably interpret domination as injustice. Jenkins likewise looks to a council of indigenous Christian theologians where he finds, surprisingly of all things, a redemption of creation stewardship theologies. If humans are ordained to be stewards, he writes, the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, which has long been ridiculed by dominant culture, holds the wisdom for that religious task. Here, then, is not a picture of incompetence, of incoherent moral agency, but rather an exemplary account, in Jenkins' terms, of meaningful human agency derived from traditional wisdom in the face of an unprecedented problem. And so it is essential for those of us in the North Atlantic, North American context that we learn to listen to these voices. We are responsible to overcome our moral incompetence, and this requires first that we learn to recognize it. Despite Jenkins' protest that conversion language can be unhelpful here, as the global South calls the North to accounts, conversion born out of listening as we are judged is exactly what Jenkins says we need. The judgment from the global South is to be illuminating, to lift the scales from our eyes. And so here Jenkins frequently uses the language of recognition and acknowledgement. We must recognize and acknowledge our incompetence. Indigenous theologians, Jenkins writes, seek cultural conversion in the North. They expect North Atlantic Christians to join their witness. But what this suggests is that the problem we face is not that climate change overwhelms moral agency simply considered. It overwhelms our moral agency. And it does so long as we remain unwilling to hear the voices on the margins of power who speak truthfully into power. It's not that the Christian repertory simply considered is incompetent, but that it is incompetent so long as it is unwittingly embroiled in systems of injustice that reinforce the problem. So long as Christians, this is just for example, so long as Christians neglect to repent of their complicity in these systems, even if there is very little they might be able to do, so long as they don't turn in some way from these systems of power, their agency remains incoherent. And here it is important to observe that to call one's agency incompetent is a post-conversion way of speaking. It indicates already a move toward competence. But the question I want to conclude with is this. If we are embroiled in networks of power that insinuate themselves in our lives in so many subtle ways that our own incompetence is opaque to us, if our sense of ourselves as moral agents is conditioned by a way of life that conceals the fundamental incompetence and incoherence of our moral agency, how is it that these calls to conversion from the South might have any hope to find fertile ground? How is it that cultural conversion is possible? It is a similar question to one we might pose to Niebuhr when his conscientious person finds herself with a clash of ego-alter dialectics. Why this one and not that one? I think a different theory of conscience might be able to help us answer this question. For Immanuel Kant, conscience is the subjective principle of being accountable to God in all one's deeds. And it is the means we have to make a reasonable conjecture about the state of our hearts before God, as God holds us accountable to a non-contingent, non-empirical claim that God makes upon us for the sake of a common good. And indeed, we have a duty to search and know our hearts in an effort to approximate God's knowledge of our hearts, because, Kant thinks, we must combat our natural propensity to deceive ourselves. And important for this current discussion, Kant thinks one significant means to self-deception is social life. In our life together, Kant writes, we will mutually corrupt each other's moral dispositions and make one another evil. Kant thinks we easily can desensitize each other to vice as vice, because our customs can render what we know to be vicious appear to be normal. Consequently, we count someone as good, Kant concludes, when his evil is common to a class. We have a propensity to use social life to persuade ourselves that our vicious behavior is actually virtuous. Kant worries about our proclivity to what he calls self-incurred minority. He worries, in other words, about our proclivity to allow others to determine for us what is right, and that we will take as morally normative, consequently, the contingent private demands laid upon us by those we happen to meet throughout the course of our lives. Kant insists that morality is not confined to the contingencies of our lives in this way, and he insists furthermore that if we are to be moral, it is up to each of us to recognize what is right and to act accordingly. And so he worries about the injury done to the public good when such self-incurred minority rules the day. A clear inference of Kant's thought here is that when a community makes a demand upon us that is immoral, we have the capacity to recognize the demand as immoral and the responsibility to resist it. Kant's practical philosophy is not unable to accommodate the idea that our subjective state is to some extent socially formed in the way Niebuhr describes, in ways that are both healthy and deadly. But Kant argues that the individual must have some kind of access to something that is beyond the claims of the community so that she can enter into the life or hear the claims of one community that calls into question the life of another as unjust. And so for the sake of life in community with others, Kant thinks there must be some kind of self-disclosing accountability that is distinct from the internalization of external social mores, distinct from the self-understanding of particular communities. For Kant, it is through practical reason that human beings grasp moral norms that are universal and binding, and it is through the conscience that human beings know themselves before these norms as if they were given by God. To be clear, we might very much need the help of others. In fact, this is exactly the point, to be reminded or to wake up to the fact of our accountability before these norms. But ultimately, we are responsible before them in a singular way. If this were not the case, it is hard to imagine how these other voices will find any kind of ground in us that might be able to receive their judgment and then for us to respond accordingly. We might take issue with Kant's confidence in practical reason, but even then, it is still possible to affirm that our moral self-awareness and our accountability to God are distinct from our moral self-awareness and our accountability to others. And I think this is a distinction we need in the global north, especially if we want to understand how it is possible that the judgment upon us and the call to conversion that come to us from the south might break the spell of our self-deception and lead to more competent responses to the problem of climate change. Thanks.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of our presenters for staying right on time. We are right where we should be. At 6 o'clock, we've got plenty of time for questions. And so we've got 3 microphones here. I'm going to start by just posing one across the board to everyone. So to Daniel, a quick question here. I know you were working on the paper. We had this conversation before you saw the statement. You were thinking about some of the stuff. One question I want to ask you is, what was not anticipated in the actual principles that you saw that you already had in your head as you were thinking about the principles ahead of time? Let me get all three of them on the table, and we'll kind of go down, and then we'll go here. So I would love to hear about that. And then to Robin, I want to just ask about this God is in control variable, because one of the things that we found in the study was that, in fact, this affirmation that God is in control would not allow humans to destroy the earth was believed by evangelicals, certainly affirmed by evangelicals more than others. But when we actually looked at the correlations, it had only a modest correlation to beliefs about human causation of climate change. So one question to you is, what does this suggest? At least one reading of this is that saying God is in control is something evangelicals say to dismiss a proposition they don't like on other grounds, right? So it's a theological way of sort of making a move. It's not actually the thing doing the work. But I'd love to know what you think about that, having immersed yourself in this world. And then to Jeffrey, I really appreciate the careful exposition here. But again, one of the things from the empirical data, it's one of the, I think, stunning findings is just clear that Americans, particularly white Americans, believe that climate change is someone else's problem, right? And it's a really, really thorny problem. So one question is, and we see Latinos, African Americans having much higher levels of concern, much more beliefs that it's happening, and I think part of it is because they're hearing the voices that you were talking about. So I want to sort of ask you to speculate about the how problem. If these voices aren't getting heard, how might that happen to arise a kind of higher level of some kind of dissonance among white Americans who seem to be fairly insulated from the problem, at least at present? All right, so we'll do that, and then we'll take questions. So if you could be brief, so we won't take up too much time.
Oh, these are on. Okay, good. Well, so what Robbie was talking about is that my initial paper proposal was to actually construct policy criteria from a Catholic perspective for the carbon pollution rules. And so the proposal was accepted, and then the bishops published policy criteria for carbon pollution rules. And so I basically had to audible and critique what I was originally going to construct. So as I said, or as Robbie said, I work part-time with the Catholic Climate Covenant, so we actually work with the USCCB, and so I knew what was going to be in the letter, so in that sense, I knew what was going to be there, so there wasn't a whole lot that was surprising. I think there were two things that maybe surprised me in terms of how it was structured and what wasn't there. The first is that, and this is kind of the impetus for the paper, was that the bishops conflated virtues and precepts, and so they articulated prudence and justice as precepts rather than virtues, and so I think that got a little mixed up. And then the other one, the precept that I thought was going to be there was subsidiarity, because I think that's really part of what grounds the policy criteria is the fact that lower levels have not been able to address climate change effectively. So.
Okay. I'm still thinking about the answer to that, actually, and I would like to think about it some more and look a little more closely at your data. I have a couple thoughts about this, and I don't know what the actual answer is. One, obviously, maybe I'm totally wrong. I perhaps have made some error in extrapolating this God is in control narrative more broadly, and I did hear it over and over again, regardless of what church I was at. So I was very surprised that it did not come up. However, one thing that I would point out is that there's another set of studies that I've been looking at, which asks climate denialists their reasons for being not accepting that climate change is happening, and there was between, I think, 2006 and like 2012, there was a growing number that cited religious factors. It went from like 0 to 16%. And then when the weather became, we had a couple cold winters, and then everybody suddenly switched to saying, oh, it's weather patterns. Because that's the most plausible interpretation. I think everybody would like to be able to say, it's obviously not happening because of my personal experience. But when the weather is not cooperating, if you have a warm winter, then people go back and say, well, I don't believe it for religious reasons. So I think there's sometimes can be a trade-off there between the reasons that people are giving, and they may have underlying reasons, like this is my second rationale that I'm going to go back to. So I'll stop there. I want to think about it more too.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Obviously, making the comment about sort of this insular world of white evangelicals, you could say, having little concern, whereas Latino and African Americans are voices. In the paper, and Jenkins himself focuses on this in a global justice frame, but we could just as easily do it domestically. And of course, those are communities that are actually suffering injustices from ecological degradation. So, how those voices are heard by? This is a very challenging talk because the extent to which there is this embattled mentality seems like it's a pretty thick wall. But I don't know. Maybe the strategy has to be fairly pragmatic. Maybe this is a bad analogy for environmental ethics kind of panel, but eating the elephant one bite at a time, and take a particular issue. Maybe it's just too much to talk about anthropogenic climate change, and take a particular issue like something like environmental racism, and like, why is this landfill going in this neighborhood? Raising awareness. I can only speak to what I might do here, and raising awareness to that, like, with my students, and they find that compelling, and then maybe that starts a trail and a domino effect. Yeah, it's a difficult question.
Very great. Well, let me open it up to the floor. It's a big room, so even though it seems a little weird, if you could go to the microphones, I think it'll actually help us hear, just because it's such a big room. So there's three of them here, so if you could just take your pick, and then I will referee a little bit here. All right, so let me go here, and if you could just state your name and where you're from, and then I'll steal a line from Eric Owens, and then sort of either ask a question or give a short speech disguised as a question.
Okay, well, I'm Robin's colleague at Iowa State University. And my question is for Robin. In thinking about reframing these critical issues of climate change for evangelicals, I'm really perplexed by this sentiment of hostility in the United States. Do you think it's peculiar to the United States, particularly when you compare it and contrast it with other areas where Christians have undergone some sort of direct persecution by the state? Where do you think this perception is it rooted within something within the American ethos? Can we generalize? If so, can understanding that help us reframe the issues for evangelicals here in the U.S.?
Yeah, well, I think it is rooted to U.S. culture, but I don't think understanding that will help us reframe the issues, because I think that just shows how intractable this mentality has become. I'm trying to understand this better. I'm looking into history a little bit more, and I'm seeing it go back to the divisions in society that happened in the 1960s and 70s, especially the switch from divisions among religious traditions, from Protestant, Catholic, Jew, to being aligned along conservative and religious lines. And those lines cut very deep, and the depth of that division is something we still see today. American society is growing ever more divided. And I think Christianity is part of that divide. It's been swept up in that divide. So, it's a question about how can you make American society less divided, and that is almost a worse question than how could we solve climate change. It's so I don't know what the answer to it is, but I think it is historically rooted in some way in some of the conflicts that happened in U.S. history.
So you don't think that understanding that, what you mentioned, you don't think that understanding that would help actually anything here with reframing questions for evangelicals? I think
it just the way I understand it now is that it only goes to show just how deeply rooted it is, and that's what makes me a little bit pessimistic about it. But I think other people have talked about this too in some of the panels I've been to. You don't have to get 100% of Americans to agree on this. You have to get a small core of committed individuals that can mobilize enough people to make a show, to show that there's some force behind this. And so therefore you don't necessarily have to transcend these divisions. The civil rights movement created a lot of divisions and pissed a lot of people off, and in fact contributed to some of these divisions that we still see today. But you may not need to transcend the divisions in order to create a successful movement. So that might be one piece of the way forward.
Right, go here.
Bernie Zelaya from UC Santa Cruz, and my question's from Robin as well. And Robin, in your talk, I don't think I heard you specifically tie the embattlement as creating evangelical identity to their eschatological expectations. But it occurs to me that that embattlement trait could also be, it's not, they almost need to feel embattled in order for their eschatologies that they hope for to be realized. And so they need to see themselves as persecuted, even as, at least counterintuitive as that seems, in a dominant Christian nation, that the dominant religion isn't somehow being persecuted. And as evangelicals, they're also one of the largest segments of American Christianity, which also seems to make the idea that they're embattled to anybody outside that group not make any sense, but that inside within that community, there is this need to understand themselves embattled in order for the end time fulfillments to be satisfied. And I'm wondering the degree to which you've already thought about that.
Yes, I've thought about that. Well, I think actually one of the ironies of this, that I did, my dissertation was looking at end-time beliefs, and that was my key focus on how end-time beliefs play into this climate change skepticism, whether it does at all. And ironically, actually, they are skeptical about climate change, even though you could potentially play that into the end-time scenario. So that shows how committed they are to skepticism, even though it would help anybody who would like to believe that things are, the end is approaching. So, I think that that's one of the reasons I said that I think the embattled mentality underlies some of the theological positions that they hold, because I think it all goes back to the desire to protect, to hold the Bible against the onslaught of modernity. And part of that, the result of that, was that they felt compelled to read Revelation literally. So, and then part of that led into the sense of opposition with mainstream society, which becomes later embattlement. So their holding on to end times theology is definitely connected to the embattled mentality, and yet I didn't see people saying that. I never heard anyone say, I want the world to, I want climate change to be happening. That's not true. There's a small number of people who are really excited about the end times, but the majority of people did not read it in that way. So I guess I wouldn't take it that far, but the two are certainly connected.
Hi, my name is Karen, and I'm a doctoral candidate at Pacifica Graduate Institute. I'm an older returning student and have spent a good 35 years on the culture war front lines. And that's my question for Robin, really, is, while you were talking, I was thinking about the culture wars that we've been going through since the 1960s and how we've created winners and losers. And when you're the loser in a war, you take on that embattlement persona because you've just been conquered and you're trying to retreat into a safe space to survive this sense of being conquered. And the culture wars aren't over, they're ongoing right now. We're seeing the gay marriage, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender rights are continuing to put pressure on these communities and forcing change where perhaps people don't want change. And I'm reminded of Dr. King's words during the Civil Rights Movement, and thank you for reminding me about that it isn't enough to win the rights that you want, but you have to end up making friends of the people who are on the losing side. And I think that maybe we can look at how we have failed to enact that portion of Dr. King's vision, and how we can perhaps look at other types of wars that we have engaged in. I've lived in California since I was 3, San Diego probably 30 years on and off. During the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese were the enemies. When Saigon fell, Vietnamese families, Vietnamese friends of the United States came back here to San Diego, to Camp Pendleton, which is the Marine base at the north end of the county, in mass. And San Diego County and Orange County ended up having one of the largest Vietnamese populations of any place in the country. And now that culture is integral to the culture of Southern California as a whole. So it makes me think in the way that when we go to war with something, we kind of bring back whatever it is we thought we were fighting and incorporate it into our culture. And I'm seeing the same thing now. The number of Islamic families in my area is increasing exponentially. You know, San Diego having all these strong military ties, we go out, we make war, we bring people back with us. And the visible presence of Islam in my community now is very high, where 15 or 20 years ago was very small. It's very small, and I don't really have any answers here. I'm just trying to maybe open up some other lines of thinking that we could maybe apply to this same situation, because I do think that for a lot of people, these cultural changes that we've gone through has been a war, and they've been the losers in the war.
Yeah, you're saying like evangelical Christians are the losers?
Yes, or people who believe, not just evangelical Christians, but anybody who has a literalist belief of their scripture would be the victim, and anybody who's trying to hold on to a past that perhaps never was, but to live in that space, regardless of the changes taking place around them.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with that perspective, and it's something that I realized when I went out and did my field research. I mean, I realized a lot of things. One is that most environmentalists don't know any conservative Christians, and neither side knows the other side, and both sides kind of hate the other side and has these unwarranted stereotypes about the other side, as if neither could ever, put together a full sentence or something like that. And it's like you see things on Facebook, and when I came out of the field, I would see these things that my friends had posted and be like, why would you say that? That's just such a horrible thing to say. And I think there is an attitude problem which we projected on the religious right, but it is to some extent shared on the other side, a kind of intolerance. And it's a tricky question too, because you don't want to, tolerate the person who, say, disrespects gay rights or something like that. And I don't know, we're still working out those questions, but I think that there has been a tendency to almost dehumanize. I mean, I've met a lot of really nice, kind people, and I don't agree with a lot of their views, but you can't have a conversation if you don't try to break through those stereotypes. So I would definitely agree with that, with what you're saying, and hopefully that provides something of a way forward. Great.
All right, any other questions? Yep.
How do you get people to care for creation? The Catholic view seems to assume that we have some responsibility for the care of creation, and it goes on to ask, well, how do we do it? What's the problem? Whose problem is it? I don't see that it's anyone's problem if they have other problems that are more important, that require business profit, and that would contradict care for creation. So whose problem is it? Well, in general, the problem seems to be a problem for those who suffer, either for those who identify with some kind of a task or purpose that's being frustrated but also that they suffer from. Well, who's suffering? Well, business isn't suffering, you know. Who is suffering? Well, anyone who's identified with this project of stewardship might be suffering. Well, there are certain countries, certain peoples that are suffering, but I'm not one of those, so well, it's not my problem unless my problem is their suffering. So as long as I'm not suffering and the other people who suffer aren't my problem, then what do I care? You know, how do I get involved with this? In what sense is climate change my problem? So I would suggest that there's a question of what climate change is that's a problem. I mean, it can change, but so what? Well, it changes in a way that makes a difference. Well, a difference to whom and how? You know, if it doesn't make any difference to me, then it's not going to be my problem.
Great,
So
thank you. Well, why don't we see if we have Daniel or Jeffrey, either one of you want to take up a response to that?
Well, I mean, I think, if I understand your question, it's how do you motivate based on something beyond self-interest, I guess is how I would interpret the question. And I think if that's the question, then I think that's where framing it within the context of Catholic social teaching gives a language that might be able to inspire some of that transformation in terms of connecting it to solidarity, connecting it to the common good. So, I mean, I think there are theological resources within the Catholic tradition that we can use to appeal beyond kind of a myopic self-interest. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Well, can the evangelical tradition?
So let me get another question in here from the other. Thank you.
Sorry, this is going to be another question for Robin, but I guess one question I had as I was listening to your presentation, a sense of embattlement can attach itself to a lot of things, and I wasn't sure I had an explanation from your talk of why in this case, it attaches itself to climate change. So I wonder if you could comment on that. I think in order for your explanation to I think to succeed, I think you'd have to explain that.
Yes, absolutely. And it probably went on the cutting room floor as I was trying to pack this into a short amount of time. The connection is that evangelicals tend to see climate change as something that's being promoted by people like Al Gore, people who are part of the world that they're in opposition to. So, and I talk about this at length in my dissertation, how they have a sense of, environmentalists are the other. They represent they are part of this threat. They are part of the cadre that's trying to push them out of society. So that's the connection that they see.
Great. Any other questions? Okay, yep. Yeah, so the question was, would it be better then to get someone like Rick Warren rather than Al Gore to promote it? Would that help?
Yeah, well, I mean, Rick Warren does promote. He has taken a stance on climate change, so.
But we've had Jonathan Merritt, we've had,
I mean, they're all
Cizik,
still dealing with that. And actually, it's interesting, too, because I just looked into Rick Warren as, I'm like, why him? And he explicitly talks about the need to tone down the language and adopt a different attitude, one that is not one of embattlement. So in every case that I can find, when people take on the issue of climate change, they then do tone down the rhetoric. So those two do seem to be connected. But I mean, I just go back to it's really hard to convince evangelicals because there has been so much groundwork laid over decades creating that sense. And actually following up on a comment that was made earlier, it made me realize actually that this whole argument that they're making that there is a war on Christians, I think part of the reason it has gained so much steam is because I don't think and I may be going out on a limb in saying this, I just sort of thought of this, but I don't think it's widely recognized the extent to which they are perceiving a loss in status, and there is a truth to that. They have declined from being the moral center of American society to being marginalized, and of course, there's some truth to that perception. I think there's a lot of denial that, they have this crazy, there's a war on Christmas and none of this, it's like they're mocked all, instead of realizing that, they're losing something. And perhaps if people on the left could acknowledge that. It's the same way you get through an argument with somebody is to show that you understand their perspective. Sometimes that can make them not want to argue with you, even if you end up still disagreeing. It's just that shift in attitude that you can show that you see it from the other side, and I think that hasn't really occurred, and that's why I think that this dynamic is not just a problem that's coming from the right, but I think in part it has to do with the left as well.
Other questions? I'm going to ask one more quick one if you'll be patient enough. One of the striking things in the empirical data in the national study is that white Catholics, that may kind of tie this all together, that white Catholics are as likely as white evangelicals, only a few points difference, to be unconcerned about climate change. And I think you can't quite explain that with the embattlement motif. And they do have at their resources Catholic social teaching and this big history of that. So I'd love to hear the panel, what do you make of that, right? That Latino Catholics are way over here, high levels of support, white Catholics way over here, really up next to white evangelicals in terms of their concern about the issue.
Yeah, I can speak to that. That's kind of the world I live in. I think, a lot of it, somebody talked about the culture wars, and I think that's in large part, at least in my experience, what has probably driven that statistic, in the sense that over the last 20 or 30 years, there's been this increasing, kind of inter-Catholic partisanship that's emerged. I think, that's kind of come down on two very distinct sides, and so I think, George Weigel is kind of one of the proponents of, this kind of embattled identity, and his book is Evangelical Catholicism, and I think, there's a faction of the Catholic Church that really does, kind of identify with this culture warrior mentality. So I think that dynamic is operative in the Catholic world, as much as the evangelical.
Sorry. My very bold claim is just that white evangelicals and white Catholic Christians can become concerned. I mean, so how that goes about being possible. Part of the concern here is that, well, how do we get that to happen? I just think it's not a hopeless thing, so it can. And I think that talking about the conscience is it's a helpful way of explaining maybe what's going on when that concern arises.
That was really interesting to hear. What Dan said, Dan, right, goes back to the divides between religious liberals and conservatives instead of divides that fall on denominational lines that has started to happen in this country in the last 50 years or so. There's always the argument that, people don't believe in climate change when it's not convenient for them to do so, and I think that does explain a lot of climate change skepticism. But another thing we haven't talked about as much, and which I originally thought I would talk about in this paper, but then couldn't talk about everything, was that these communities become enclaves in which, and I can't remember, I definitely was at another talk where somebody brought this up, but enclaves where it becomes unacceptable to bring up your belief in climate change socially, because that is making you kind of an outsider and saying it's threatening to the group, and people's social status becomes tied up in holding on to the same belief. And in the evangelical circles I visited, climate change, it was so broadly skeptical, so assumed that you would be skeptical, that the climate change for them was a joke. It was like a punchline. And you can joke about things that everybody agrees with you about. That's what constitutes, in part, what makes something okay to joke about. And I'm wondering if there's something similar going on in Catholic circles where it becomes like everybody around you seems to be skeptical, and therefore it's uncomfortable to I think that might sustain some of that skepticism. Even if it doesn't create it, it might sustain it.
Great. Well, please join me giving a hand to our panelists here, from our presenters. Real quick before you jump up, just want to, this is a session of the Religion and Politics section. We have two very exciting panels tomorrow that I hope you will come to. One is actually on the construction of kind of religious symbols and secularisms in international perspectives. They'll have papers looking at these very interesting cases in Turkey and Canada of how religion is constructed, how secularism is constructed in public policy. And then in the afternoon session, we will have another one on conservative Christian politics 2.0, is what we've called the session, which will pick up some of the themes that we've talked about here. So if you want to hear more about that, that's in the afternoon at 4 o'clock tomorrow. So thank you all.